Chapter 1. Europe in the Age of Discoveries. When Ferdinand Magellan made his plans to find a western route to the legendary Spice Islands at the beginning of the 16th century, Europe was in an era of profound changes. In retrospect, this age is referred to as the Age of Discoveries, and it was marked by a previously unknown dynamic in politics, business, and culture. The centuries of the Middle Ages, which had been a time of relative isolation for many regions of Europe, were coming to an end. Trade, seafaring, and scientific curiosity opened up new horizons, and the monarchies of Europe began to compete in a race for power and wealth on the world's oceans. The political landscape of Europe around 1500 was determined by two developments: the rise of strong nation-states and the rivalry between the two Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal. While many regions of the continent were still fragmented, Italy into small principalities and city republics, the Holy Roman Empire into countless territories, Spain and Portugal had developed into united kingdoms that now directed their energies outwards. Spain had risen to become a major European power in 1492 through the unification of Castile and Aragon under Isabella and Ferdinand. Portugal had already gained a head start on the world's oceans through a long tradition of seafaring and voyages of discovery. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492 had radically changed the idea of the world. Until then, the image of Europe had been strongly influenced by the teachings of ancient scholars and medieval traditions. The Atlantic was considered a dangerous, insurmountable sea, behind which only myths and uncertainty awaited. Columbus' voyage, which in reality opened up the American continent and not the hoped-for sea route to India, showed that the world was larger than had previously been assumed. But at the same time, it opened up the question: where were the borders of this new world, and how could they be used for trade and power politics? Under the leadership of Henry the Navigator and later kings such as John II and Manuel I, Portugal had opened up the sea route around Africa to India. With Vasco da Gama's successful trip to Calicut in 1498, it was possible to enter directly into the spice trade, which had been dominated by Arab merchants and Venetian merchants until then. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were invaluable in Europe, not only as a condiment, but also for food preservation and medicine. The profits from this trade were so enormous that they could shake the rich and shift the balance of power. Portugal, with its colonies in Africa and Asia, secured a supremacy that challenged Spain. In order to settle the rivalry, the two powers had concluded the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the world into two zones of influence, to the east of an imaginary line, Portugal to the west, and Spain to the west. But this classification was based on an incomplete view of the world. At that time, no one in Europe knew exactly how big Asia was, how far the American continent extended, or where the legendary Spice Islands, the Moluccas, were located. It was precisely this uncertainty that made the Age of Discovery so exciting and dangerous. In addition to political and economic motives, there were also spiritual and cultural reasons for the great time of discovery. The Renaissance had changed the spirit of Europe. Curiosity, scientific thinking, and the pursuit of knowledge gained in importance. The works of ancient scholars were rediscovered, but also critically questioned. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the middle of the 15th century contributed to the faster dissemination of maps, reports, and new findings. Cosmography, navigation, and astronomy developed rapidly, and new technical aids such as the compass, the astrolabe, and improved ships such as the caravel made voyages across the ocean possible in the first place. In this world, the urge to cross borders grew. The explorers were not only on behalf of kings and merchants, but they also saw themselves as pioneers who wanted to lift the veil of the unknown. At the same time, they were often adventurers, driven by fame and the prospect of wealth. Religious zeal also played a role. The spread of Christianity was considered by many rulers to be just as important as the expansion of their sphere of influence. Missionaries accompanied the ships, and each new discovery was also seen as an opportunity to spread the faith. But the Age of Discovery was not only an era of progress and increased knowledge. It was also a time of violence, subjugation, and exploitation. The encounter with new cultures rarely led to an exchange at eye level. Rather, peoples in Africa, Asia, and America were forced into colonial structures, their riches plundered and their societies profoundly changed. Slave trade, proselytizing by force, and the destruction of entire cultures were just as much a part of this era as technical innovation and scientific curiosity. Ferdinand Magellan also moved in this field of tension between curiosity and greed, between progress and violence, between fame and tragedy. As a Portuguese navigator, he was part of the generation that grew up aware that the world was no longer confined to the Mediterranean, but that there were oceans, islands, and countries to be discovered. He saw Vasco da Gama open the way to India, how Columbus discovered America, how Portuguese and Spanish ships reached Africa, Asia, and the New World. All of this shaped his idea that he, too, could secure his place in history through a groundbreaking journey. Magellan was a child of this epoch, and at the same time he was to complete it with his journey. For what Columbus had begun, the discovery of new worlds on the other side of the Atlantic, and what the Portuguese had already partially implemented through their voyages to India and China, finally led Magellan to a first, albeit incomplete, circumnavigation of the world. He connected the oceans, showed that the Earth was indeed round and contiguous, and brought a piece of evidence that was invaluable to humanity. But before that happened, the ground had been prepared by the Age of Discovery, by the political rivalries between Spain and Portugal, by the economic greed for spices and wealth, by the technical and scientific curiosity, and by the religious zeal that characterized Europe. Without this environment, Magellan's journey would hardly have been conceivable. He was not just a lone adventurer, but part of a movement that drove Europe out into the world and irrevocably changed the history of mankind. Chapter 2. Magellan's Early Years in Portugal. Ferdinand Magellan, Fernão de Magalhães in Portuguese, was born around 1480 in northern Portugal, probably in the small town of Sabrosa in the district of Villarreal. There is little information about his early childhood, but even these gaps are indicative of the origins of a man who would later sail the oceans. He did not come from the highest aristocracy, but from a lower noble family, which opened up access to education and courtly service. His family was connected to the royal family, which gave Magellan the opportunity to be educated as a page at the Portuguese court. The years of his youth at court were decisive for his development. Here he learned reading, writing, Latin, and the basics of mathematics, but above all he gained access to the bodies of knowledge that were central to Portugal in the late 15th century: geography, astronomy, and navigation. In the royal library and in the environment of the court scholars, he was able to study maps, read travel reports, and familiarize himself with the latest findings in seafaring. He grew up in an atmosphere of adventure and discovery, as Portugal was the leading seafaring nation in Europe at the time. The school of the court was at the same time a school of discipline. As a page, Magellan served members of the nobility. He learned the manners of the courtly world, the use of weapons, and how to behave in society. This training made him a man who could move in the world of merchants as well as in that of warriors. It became clear to him early on that as a member of a lower noble family, he could not achieve his fame and wealth through land or inheritance, but that he had to seek his fortune on the oceans. During this time, he was influenced by the great stories of Portuguese sailors. Vasco da Gama had found the sea route to India in 1498, Bartolomeu Dias had advanced as far as the Cape of Good Hope, and other captains explored the coasts of Africa, Asia, and Brazil. All these names and stories awakened in the young Magellan a longing for distance and adventure. He grew up in a country that drew its identity from seafaring, and he felt part of this mission to explore the world and make it usable for Portugal. Around 1505, at the age of about 25, Magellan entered the service of the Portuguese fleet. He joined the armada of Francisco de Almeida, which had the task of securing Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. For the young Magellan, this was the beginning of a long military and seafaring career. The fleet sailed to East Africa and India, and Magellan experienced for the first time the hardships and dangers of a long sea voyage: storms, disease, lack of water, and the constant risk of attack by enemies. In India and the Indian Ocean, Magellan came into contact with cultures that were new and fascinating to him. He saw the Islamic world of the Middle East, he heard about the Spice Islands in the distance, and he realized how rich the world was beyond Europe. These impressions broadened his horizons. They awakened in him the realization that the earth was larger than one had imagined in his youth, and that there were still many paths to follow. His participation in Portuguese expeditions also took him to Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, one of the most important trading centers of the time. Here he learned the importance of the spices that Europe weighed in gold, and he understood that control of the trade routes could lead to immeasurable wealth. He saw the connections between Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian traders and realized that Portugal wanted to penetrate these networks through its naval power. But the years in the Portuguese service were not only marked by successes. Magellan also came into conflict, both with locals and with Portuguese officers. His personality was characterized by ambition and self-confidence, and he often clashed with superiors. These conflicts were to become even more significant in later years, when he broke with the Portuguese royal family. Despite these difficulties, Magellan gained a reputation as an experienced and reliable navigator. He was not only brave in battle, but also skilled with maps, compass, and stars. His training at court, combined with practical experience at sea, made him a man who combined theory and practice. This was a rare combination that set him apart from many of his comrades. When he returned to Europe after several years in the service of Portugal, he was no longer an inexperienced page, but a hardened officer with knowledge of the vastness of the Indian Ocean, of foreign countries and peoples, of trade and war. But at the same time, he was also a man who was aware that his position in the Portuguese Empire was limited. The high nobility and the court officials saw him as a useful officer, but not necessarily a man to whom one would entrust great orders or independent expeditions. In his youth, Magellan had learned that fame and recognition did not just fall from the sky. They had to be fought for, worked for, and suffered. This attitude was to accompany him throughout his life. He was willing to take risks to achieve great things, and he was convinced that his destiny was not to remain in the shadow of others as a petty nobleman. Already in his youth, the thought matured in him that he had to go down in history through an extraordinary deed. Thus, in the years of his youth in Portugal, the personality that later crossed the oceans was formed, a man of ambition, courage, and perseverance, marked by the traditions of his country, but also ready to transcend them when his path required it. Ferdinand Magellan was a child of an era that strove for distance and fame, and at the same time a young man who felt that he himself was destined for more than just being an officer among many. His youth in Portugal was the necessary basis for the adventure that would later make him immortal. Chapter 3. In the Service of Portugal, Travels to India, East Africa, and Experiences in the Indian Ocean. When Ferdinand Magellan entered the service of the Portuguese crown in the early years of the 16th century, a phase began for him that was to have a lasting impact on his life. Portugal was at the forefront of maritime expansion at the time. With the conquest of Ceuta in 1415, the first step into Africa had been taken. Later Bartholomew Diaz had sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, and in 1498 Vasco da Gama had opened up the direct sea route to India. With this, the Portuguese had opened the door to a new age in which they wanted to be not only traders, but lords of the seas. Magellan thus joined a fleet that had a clear mission: to secure and expand the Portuguese Empire. Magellan made his first major voyage in 1505, when he became part of the armada of Francisco de Almeida. This expedition was the first to have the goal of establishing a permanent Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean. Almeida was installed as the first viceroy of India, and his fleet consisted of 20 large ships equipped for both war and trade. For Magellan, who had previously served mainly at court, this was a leap into the harsh reality of the oceans. Even the crossing to Africa was dangerous, and storms, hunger, and diseases claimed their first victims. But the Portuguese fleet was determined to make its way. On this expedition, Magellan experienced the conquest of important bases on the east coast of Africa. In Sofala, Kilwa, and Mombasa, the fleet encountered wealthy Islamic trading cities that had been linked to India, Persia, and Arabia for centuries. These cities were at the center of the Swahili trade network, which traded in ivory, gold, and spices. For the Portuguese, they were not only trading centers, but also obstacles as they attacked supremacy in the Indian Ocean. Magellan witnessed how the Portuguese acted with brutal severity, bombing cities and blocking ports. For the young officer, this was a first glimpse of the violence that accompanied European colonialism. When the fleet reached the Indian Ocean, Magellan came into contact with a world far larger and richer than he had ever imagined. India, with its markets, palaces, and temples, made a deep impression on him. In Calicut, one of the most important ports on the Malabar coast, he encountered the spice trade in full bloom. Traders from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and Southeast Asia flocked here to trade in pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and other treasures. Magellan immediately understood why Europe was willing to risk enormous sums and lives to gain access to these treasures. However, the Portuguese had to secure their presence militarily, because Arab and Indian traders saw them as intruders. Magellan experienced naval battles in which the Portuguese used their superior cannons to smash enemy fleets. At a time when naval battles often still amounted to boarding maneuvers, artillery was a weapon that gave the Europeans a decisive advantage. For Magellan, this was a school of war at sea. He learned the importance of technique and discipline, and he understood that the success of the Portuguese was based not only on courage, but on planning and innovation. In addition to India, his service also took him to Malacca, the Malay Peninsula, which was one of the most important hubs of global trade. This is where the goods from China, India, Arabia, and the Spice Islands met. Malacca was a prosperous city, populated by merchants of many nations, and Magellan experienced how cosmopolitan trade was in this region. For him, it was a glimpse into a world where cultures and religions collided, where wealth was created through diversity. The Portuguese recognized the importance of Malacca and conquered the city with great brutality in 1511. Magellan took part in this conquest and showed bravery in the battles. The conquest of Malacca opened the way for the Portuguese to the Moluccas, the legendary Spice Islands. Although Magellan did not reach these islands himself, he heard about them, and these reports shaped his ideas for the future. He now knew that the spices that Europe weighed in gold came from islands in the east, which could perhaps also be reached by a western route. This thought would not let him go later. During his time in Portuguese service, Magellan learned not only about the riches of Asia, but also about the hardships of life in the colonies. Disease, hunger, and constant fighting made life dangerous. The teams often shrank dramatically, and discipline had to be maintained with severity. Magellan showed a tenacity in these situations that distinguished him as an officer. He could lead people, he could keep calm in danger, and he was prepared to take on great hardships himself. But not everything went in his favor. Magellan came into conflict with superiors who perceived his independence and self-confidence as a threat. In Morocco, where he took part in a campaign against the Moors in 1513, he was wounded and got into a dispute over booty claims. Although he had rendered outstanding services, he fell out of favor at the court in Lisbon. King Manuel I did not appreciate him, denied him the recognition he expected, and considered him an officer who pushed himself too much to the fore. For Magellan, this was a bitter experience. He had spent years of his life fighting and sailing for Portugal, and yet his home country seemed to give him no place. The time in Portugal's service shaped Magellan in many ways. He got to know the world beyond Europe, experienced the richness and diversity of Asia, but also saw the cruelty and violence of colonial war. He developed skills as a navigator, and officer that distinguished him from many of his comrades. At the same time, however, he experienced how narrow the boundaries were set by his origins and Portuguese court politics. These experiences laid the foundation for his later decision to leave Portugal and enter Spanish service. He now knew where the Spice Islands were, he knew how important trade was, and he had an idea of how big the world really was. Above all, however, he had gained the inner conviction that his fate did not lie in remaining a petty officer in the service of a king who did not appreciate him. He wanted more, and he was willing to risk everything for it. Thus, his years in the service of Portugal did not end with glory and honor, but with disappointment and a break with his homeland. But without these years, without the struggles in India, the experiences in East Africa and Malacca, the encounter with the markets and cultures of the Indian Ocean, Magellan would not have become the man who later ventured on what was perhaps the boldest journey in human history. Chapter 4: Conflicts with the Portuguese court, break with his homeland. When Ferdinand Magellan returned to Europe after years in the service of the Portuguese crown, he was an experienced navigator and soldier. He had seen distant lands, fought decisive battles, and won the confidence of many of his comrades. But instead of experiencing recognition and advancement, he encountered mistrust, rejection, and open hostility in his homeland. These conflicts with the Portuguese court were to have a decisive influence on his life and eventually moved him to turn away from his homeland and enter the service of the Spanish crown. The core of the problem lay in Magellan's personality and in the political structure of Portugal. He was ambitious, self-confident, and convinced of his abilities. At the court in Lisbon, however, powerful noble families dominated who pursued their own interests and had little inclination to open up great opportunities for a man from the lower nobility. King Manuel I, who was called the Lucky One because he benefited from the discoveries and riches of the new empire during his reign, was a ruler who encouraged expansion, but at the same time was suspicious of all those who pushed themselves too much to the fore. Magellan had made enemies through his successes and his willfulness, which discredited him at court. A decisive incident occurred in 1513, when Magellan took part in a campaign in Morocco. At that time, Portugal repeatedly waged wars against the Muslim empires of North Africa in order to secure its influence in the Mediterranean. Magellan was wounded at the siege of Azama, but he fought bravely on. Later, he got into a dispute over the distribution of the spoils of war. Magellan had claimed a certain stake, but he was accused of illegally claiming profits. These charges may have been exaggerated or politically motivated, but they caused lasting damage to his reputation at court. At the same time, Magellan was looking for new tasks and opportunities. He knew about the strategic importance of the Spice Islands, which he had become acquainted with during his years in Asia. His plan was bold. He wanted to find a western sea route to these islands in order to secure Portugal an additional route that was not only dependent on the long and dangerous detour around Africa. But when he made this proposal to King Manuel I, he was rejected. The king trusted in the existing route across the Cape of Good Hope and saw no reason to make a risky and possibly useless attempt. In addition, Magellan no longer had any influential supporters at court. His opponents took the opportunity to portray him as unreliable, quarrelsome, and ambitious. For Magellan, this was a bitter disappointment. He had given his life to the service of Portugal, had fought and sailed, and yet his king refused to trust him. The rejection of his plans and the humiliations at court reinforced in him the feeling that he had no future in his own country. His pride, but also his determination to achieve something great, led him to think about alternatives. The years 1514 to 1517 were a time of transition for Magellan. He withdrew from the court, looked for supporters for his ideas, and began to think about switching to foreign services. He was not the first Portuguese to consider this step. The rivalry between Spain and Portugal meant that both sides tried to poach experienced navigators and cartographers from the other. Knowledge of routes, currents, and geography was a valuable commodity that promised power and wealth. Magellan knew that his knowledge of the Spice Islands, the Indian Ocean, and the possibilities of a western route would be of great interest to Spain. Spain had opened up new territories after the discovery of America by Columbus and the later voyages to the Caribbean and South America, but the direct spice trade routes were still firmly in Portuguese hands. A western sea route to the Moluccas would give Spain a decisive advantage. Before Magellan took this step, however, he tried once again to win the favor of his king. He asked for a new job and to have his ideas examined. But King Manuel I remained firm. Whether out of suspicion, pride, or simply because of pressure from his advisors, he rejected Magellan's requests. In 1517, the decision was made. Magellan finally turned his back on Portugal. It was a step that was tantamount to a betrayal in the eyes of many compatriots. A Portuguese who entered Spanish service was considered an apostate. But for Magellan it was an act of self-assertion. This decision marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He left Lisbon to travel to Seville, the Spanish port city that had become the center of overseas expeditions. There he sought contact with influential personalities at the court of Charles I, the young king of Spain, who was soon to steer the fate of Europe as Emperor Charles V. Magellan knew that he had to sell his plans well, as a way to enrich Spain directly and at the same time undermine Portugal's supremacy. The break with Portugal was final, and it was accompanied by bitterness and pain. Magellan knew that he would be considered a traitor in his homeland, but he was also convinced that Portugal did not deserve him. In his eyes, he was a man with a great vision, who was prevented from realizing it by petty intrigues and short-sightedness. His pride forbade him to bow to it, and so he chose the risky path that made him a stranger in foreign service. This break shows the contradictory nature of his personality. On the one hand, Magellan was a patriot who had spent his youth in the service of Portugal and had helped build his country's empire. On the other hand, he was a man who was more committed to his ambition and his desire for fame than to loyalty to a crown that had rejected him. For him, it was not which king he served that counted, but that he could realize his vision. The conflicts with the Portuguese court were thus not only a personal drama, but also an expression of the greater rivalry between Spain and Portugal. Magellan became a key figure in this power struggle because he carried knowledge and experience within him, which he now made available to the other side. At that moment, the Portuguese officer became a Spanish captain, and the path to the first circumnavigation of the world began. Chapter 5. The Dream of a Western Route to the Spice Islands. After Ferdinand Magellan left the Portuguese court and was finally determined to seek his future in Spain, his grand vision took shape more clearly than ever before. He wanted to find a way to the Spice Islands that did not lead via the route around Africa, which was strictly controlled by Portugal. For Magellan, it was not only a question of ambition, but a way to make his name immortal and at the same time lead Spain into the global power struggle with Portugal. The dream of a western route to the Moluccas, those fabled islands that produced pepper, nutmeg, and cloves, was not new in Europe, but Magellan gave it a new direction and urgency. Since Vasco da Gama opened the sea route to India via the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, Portugal dominated the spice trade. The profits from this monopoly were enormous, making Lisbon one of the richest ports in Europe. Spain, on the other hand, had made great discoveries in America through Columbus and his successors, but the hoped-for direct connection to the Spice Islands had failed to materialize. Although they had gold and silver from the New World, the coveted spices, which had become indispensable in European kitchens, pharmacies, and workshops, remained firmly in Portuguese hands. The problem lay in the geographical order created by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. He had divided the world into two zones of influence. East of the agreed line lay the right of discovery and trade with Portugal, and west with Spain. But the line was unclear, and no one knew exactly how far Asia extended or where the Spice Islands were geographically. It was precisely this blurring that offered room for Magellan's plan. He was convinced that the Moluccas lay west of the dividing line and thus fell within Spain's sphere of influence. If it were possible to reach it from the west, Spain could break the Portuguese monopoly. Magellan had gathered valuable information during his years in Asia. He knew from sailors and traders that the Moluccas were far east of India and that there were rich markets there. He knew the currents of the Indian Ocean, and he had heard reports of islands and sea routes that were still undetermined for Europeans. He used these experiences to underpin his plan. If you sailed west, along the coasts of South America, then at some point there would have to be a passage that led into the ocean beyond the continent. From there, he thought, one could sail west until one reached the Spice Islands. This idea was daring and full of uncertainties. Although Columbus had shown that it was possible to cross the Atlantic, no one knew exactly what lay beyond the discovered islands and coasts. America was not yet recognized as a continent in its own right, but was considered by many to be part of Asia. The size of the Pacific was unknown, and no one could estimate the true distances. Magellan was convinced, however, that the ocean behind America was relatively narrow and that the Moluccas could be reached quickly from there. Although there was a great danger in this miscalculation, it was also the reason why he believed so firmly in his idea. The Spanish crown was receptive to such plans. Charles I, the young king of Spain, was under pressure to open up new sources of income. Portugal's wealth from the spice trade was obvious, and Spain did not want to be left behind. In addition, The rivalry between the two Iberian powers was so great that every success of one side was perceived as a defeat of the other. Magellan offered Spain a way to turn the game around, with the knowledge of a man who knew the Portuguese system from the inside. But before Magellan received the king's support, he had to convince many. In Seville and Valladolid, the centers of Spanish seafaring and administration, he looked for allies. He won the support of important advisors to the king, including Juan de Fonseca, Bishop of Burgos, who had great influence on colonial policy. He also found support from rich merchants and bankers, who saw his plan as an opportunity to profit from the lucrative spice trade. Spain was willing to take risks, and Magellan presented himself as the man who could lead this venture. His dream of the western route was not only a geographical idea, but also a political project. He promised Spain not only wealth, but also a strengthening of its international position. If it were possible to secure the Moluccas for Spain, then the empire would not only have the New World at its disposal, but also the Asian spice trade. This would be a blow to Portugal and at the same time a triumph for the Spanish crown. Magellan knew that his plan could only succeed if he defended it with determination and self-confidence. He did not present himself as a supplicant, but as a man with a clear vision. He described his experiences in Asia, his knowledge of the sea routes, and his conviction that the journey was possible. His opponents, including Portuguese diplomats, tried to portray him as a traitor and adventurer, but his tenacity and ability to gain trust ultimately tipped the scales. However, his dream also had a personal dimension. Magellan was deeply hurt by the rejection he had experienced in Portugal. The thought of opening the way to the Spice Islands for the Spaniards as a Portuguese also had the attraction of revenge for him. He wanted to prove that his home country had made a mistake in rejecting him. By leading Spain to success, he wanted to humiliate Portugal and show himself as the greater visionary. So the dream of a western route became not only a geographical project, but a life goal. For Magellan, it was a way to inscribe his name in history. He knew that the journey was fraught with danger, that he had to reckon with unknown oceans, hostile races, and resistance within the crew. But he was convinced that he had the strength, the knowledge, and the determination to master this task. The dream of a western route to the Spice Islands was thus the driving force of his further life. He combined personal honor, political rivalry, and economic ambition. Without this dream, there would have been no first circumnavigation, because it was the engine that drove Magellan to go ahead against all odds. It was the vision of a man who thought bigger than most of his contemporaries and who was willing to risk everything, even his life, for his idea. Chapter 6: Spain as a New Chance, Meeting with King Charles I, later Charles V. When Ferdinand Magellan finally decided to leave Portugal in 1517, he was at a turning point. Behind him lay years full of travels, struggles, and disappointments. Ahead of him was the uncertainty of whether he would be heard in Spain. He knew that he had no future in his homeland, but he was equally sure that his knowledge and plans for Spain could be invaluable. So he set off for Seville, the city that had established itself as the gateway to the world's oceans and from which the great voyages to the New World were organized. Seville was a vibrant trading metropolis at that time. The Guadalquivir River connected the city to the Atlantic Ocean, and the Casa de Contratación, the Chamber of Commerce for the New World, regulated all expeditions from here. Merchants, sailors, adventurers, and diplomats populated the streets, and the atmosphere was marked by the expectation that Spain, strengthened by the discoveries in America, would expand its supremacy. For Magellan, Seville was the ideal place to present his plans. However, he did not come alone. Together with Rui Faliro, an experienced Portuguese astronomer and cosmographer who had also fallen into disgrace, he presented his project. Faliro brought the scientific legitimacy with him, while Magellan contributed his practical experience as a seafarer. Together, they formed a team that was able to credibly convey that a western route to the Moluccas was not only possible, but also promising. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. The Portuguese ambassadors to Spain watched Magellan with suspicion and tried to thwart his plans. For Portugal, he was a traitor, and it was an affront that he was now in the service of his rival. But for Spain, it was an opportunity. The Spanish crown knew that in the rivalry with Portugal, every advantage in knowledge counted, and Magellan embodied this advantage in person. The young King Charles I, who had ascended the throne in 1516, was still consolidating his position in Spain at that time. He was a native of Flanders, grandson of the famous Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, and he first had to earn the trust of his new subjects. At the same time, he was under pressure to make Spain successful in the global competition with Portugal. The wealth promised by Columbus' discoveries and conquests in America was not enough to satisfy the growing demands. Access to the Spice Islands was invaluable, and so Charles was ready to venture new ground. Magellan and Faliro presented their plans. They explained that the Moluccas fell into the Spanish sphere of influence according to Western calculations, and that it was possible to find access to the ocean beyond the continent through a previously undiscovered passage in the south of America. From there, they argued, the way to the Spice Islands was open. Their arguments were based on maps, on reports from sailors, and on their own experience. Karl was fascinated, and although he was young and still inexperienced, he recognized the opportunity. But before he made a decision, he had to listen to his counselors. There were different factions in the Spanish court. Some distrusted Magellan because he was Portuguese, others saw him as a unique opportunity. Particularly important was the attitude of the Casa de Contratación, which acted as the central authority for all overseas affairs. After consultations, in which the political consequences were also weighed, it was concluded that Magellan's project was worth a risk. In March 1518, the Treaty of Valladolid was signed. Magellan and Falero were commissioned by King Charles to equip an expedition that would find a western route to the Spice Islands. The contract stipulated that the two men would be given command of the fleet and would enjoy considerable privileges if successful. They were awarded titles, shares of the profits and governorship rights over discovered areas. Magellan thus rose from an outcast officer of Portugal to a man with a royal mission. This moment marked the final break with his homeland. Portugal reacted indignantly, and the Portuguese King Manuel I tried in vain to dissuade Charles from the project. But Magellan was now under the protection of the Spanish crown, and his plans began to take shape. The rivalry between the two Iberian empires reached a new peak, and Magellan was at the center of this conflict. For Magellan himself, the treaty was a triumph. At last he had found the recognition that had been denied him in Portugal. He was no longer an overlooked officer, but a captain with a royal mission. But with that honor came a tremendous responsibility. He knew that the expedition was dangerous, that it would lead into unknown waters, and that he had to reckon with resistance within the crew. Many Spaniards distrusted him because he was Portuguese, and it was to become apparent that this mistrust would accompany the journey. Nevertheless, this moment was the turning point of his life. Spain offered him the stage he had been looking for. With the support of the king, with the blessing of the church, and with the financing of merchants and bankers, he began to prepare the expedition. The fleet that would later go down in history was slowly taking shape, and Magellan was determined to make the dream of a western route to the Spice Islands a reality. The meeting with Charles I was therefore more than just an audience. It was the moment when Magellan rose from a disappointed officer to a visionary leader. The young king, who would later become one of the most powerful rulers in Europe as Charles V, entrusted him with a task that was greater than anything that had been undertaken before. It was a gamble for both the king and the navigator, and from that moment on both were united by the hope that this voyage would change the course of the world. Chapter 7. Preparing for the expedition, contracts, ships, crew. After the Treaty of Valladolid in March 1518, Ferdinand Magellan began an intensive phase of planning and preparation, which was to lay the foundation for one of the most important undertakings in human history. The king had given him the royal mandate to equip a fleet that would find the Western Sea route to the Spice Islands. But between the promise on paper and the actual departure lay a year full of difficulties, mistrust, and organizational hurdles. Magellan not only had to procure ships and recruit crews, but also fend off political intrigues and maintain confidence in his leadership. First of all, it was about the legal and financial foundations. The treaty with the Spanish crown was generous, but at the same time it tied Magellan and his comrade-in-arms Ruy Falero firmly to the conditions of the Casa de Contratación, the institution in Seville that supervised all expeditions. It guaranteed the equipment of the fleet and ensured that Spain retained most of the control. Magellan, however, was granted far-reaching privileges. He was to be appointed Captain General of the fleet, he was given the right to become governor of all discovered territories, and he was guaranteed a fifth of the profits as well as titles and shares in the Spice Islands. These agreements made him a partner of the crown, albeit under close observation. The financing was provided by a mixture of state funds and private investors. Merchants from Seville and Castilian bankers saw the opportunity to invest in a project that promised enormous profits if successful. The trade in spices was so lucrative that even a small share could lead to great wealth. But the investors demanded collateral, and so every step of the preparations was monitored. Magellan, who came from Portugal and was not a Spaniard, had to justify himself again and again that he put the interests of Spain before his own. A further step was the selection of the ships. A total of 5 ships were planned for the expedition: the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. They were mostly carracks and caravels, robust enough to cross the Atlantic, but by no means ideal for the unknown challenges that lay ahead. Each ship had its own crew and captain, and the fleet as a whole was under Magellan's command. This constellation was already explosive, because many of the Spanish officers mistrusted a Portuguese at the head and saw themselves as the real masters of the expedition. Recruiting the team was another difficult process. A total of about 270 men were to go on board, including sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, cooks, interpreters, and priests. They came from different regions of Spain, but also from Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, and Greece. This diversity made the expedition a multinational enterprise, but it also led to tensions. Language barriers, different traditions, and mistrust of a Portuguese captain general were constant companions. Many men did not volunteer out of a thirst for adventure, but out of necessity. Poverty, hope for loot, or the compulsion to escape punishment brought them on board. A particular problem was the relationship between Magellan and the Spanish captains who had been appointed by the crown. Among them was Juan de Cartagena, who was considered the king's watchdog and was suspicious of Magellan. Gaspar de Quesada and Luis de Mendoza, the captains of the Concepcion and the Victoria, were also among those who were critical of Magellan. This tension between a Portuguese at the top and Spanish captains with royal orders was to shape the entire voyage and later lead to open conflicts. In addition to the crew and the ships, supplies also had to be procured. The fleet was equipped with wine, olive oil, salted meat, cheese, hard bread, and legumes, as well as water barrels, powder and cannons, sails, and ropes. But supplies were limited, and no one could estimate exactly how long the journey would take. Diseases such as scurvy were a constant danger, and the hygienic conditions on board were catastrophic. Despite all the precautions, it was clear that many men would not survive the journey. Magellan himself supervised the preparations with great care. He knew that the success or failure of the expedition depended not only on his vision, but also on the smallest details. He paid attention to the quality of the ships, to the reliability of the supplies, and to the discipline of the crew. At the same time, he had to fend off political attacks. Portugal's envoys to the court in Spain tried to sabotage the expedition by portraying Magellan as a traitor and adventurer. They urged Charles I to stop the project, but the king stood by his decision. However, a blow hit Magellan when Rui Falero, his partner and comrade-in-arms, resigned shortly before departure for health and psychological reasons. Falero was considered unpredictable and was eventually excluded from the project. Magellan thus bore full responsibility for the expedition alone. On the one hand, this was a burden, because he was now without the support of a scholar, but on the other hand, it was also an opportunity, since he now had the undisputed leadership. The months of preparation showed how much Magellan distinguished himself as a leader. He demonstrated organizational skill, political steadfastness, and iron determination. But at the same time, it became apparent that the tensions between him and his Spanish officers could become dangerous. Many mistrusted him, considered him arrogant, or saw him as a tool of Portuguese interests. This skepticism was not unfounded, because Magellan was not only pursuing Spain's goals, but also his own. He wanted fame, honor, and proof that Portugal had underestimated him. In the summer of 1519, the preparations were largely completed. The ships were in the port of Seville, loaded with supplies and equipment. The men had been recruited, the captains appointed, the royal orders issued. Magellan was at the helm of what many considered to be reckless, and he knew that he was entering unknown territory with every step. The political dimension was as great as the geographical one. If the expedition succeeded, Spain would break a monopoly and celebrate Magellan as a hero. If it failed, he would not only be ruined, but also branded a traitor. The preparations had shown how closely fame and risk were linked. Everything was now ready for departure, and Magellan knew that the journey ahead of him was not only the greatest challenge of his life, but also one that would break the boundaries of human knowledge and the European world. Chapter 8. The departure from Seville in 1519, the beginning of one of the greatest journeys in human history. In the late summer of 1519, the long phase of preparation was completed. The 5 ships that formed the core of the expedition were equipped and ready in Seville. Magellan had been monitoring every detail for months, from the recruitment of men to the loading of ships to the political disputes with his opponents. Now came the moment when plan and hope became reality. The departure from Seville was not only a logistical act, but a symbolic beginning of a journey that was bigger and more dangerous than any that had been undertaken before. At that time, Seville was the heart of Spanish overseas ventures. The Guadalquivir River connected the city to the Atlantic Ocean, and the Casa de Contratación controlled every step, from permits to cargo and the selection of captains. Thousands of onlookers had gathered at the harbor to watch the spectacle. For many, it was an event that would occupy the city for a long time. Some saw it as the beginning of a new age, others as a daring adventure that could only end in misfortune. Magellan himself seemed calm on the outside, but inwardly he was aware of the implications. When he officially took command on August 10, 1519, he knew that he was on the cusp of a journey that would make him either a hero or an outlaw. His ships, the Trinidad as his flagship, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago, were loaded with supplies: salted meat, hard bread, cheese, olive oil, wine, dried beans, and chickpeas. In addition, there were water barrels, powder, weapons, and spare parts. Everything was calculated in such a way that you could be self-sufficient for many months, but no one knew how long the journey would actually take. The fleet first set sail down the Guadalquivir towards San Lucar de Barrameda, the last major port at the mouth of the Atlantic. The ships camped there for almost a month to make final preparations and wait for favorable winds. It was a time when the team felt the restlessness of waiting, and rumors made the rounds. Some said the journey was a death sentence, others murmured that Magellan was only acting on behalf of Portugal to lead Spain to ruin. These doubts were a great burden for Magellan, but he stuck to his plan unwaveringly. Finally, on September 20th, 1519, the fleet finally rose into the open waves of the Atlantic. It was a clear day, and the sails of the 5 ships billowed in the wind. Trumpets blared, the cannons fired salutes, and the people on the shore cheered. For the sailors on board, it was a moment of farewell, because many would never see their homeland again. They left behind families, friends, and everything familiar and sailed into a world that for them consisted only of maps, rumors, and the unwavering conviction of their commander. The first days at sea were characterized by the routine of seafaring: assigning watches, trimming sails, checking supplies. Magellan kept strict discipline, because he knew that morale could only be maintained through order and clear leadership. He watched attentively the officers and captains, whose loyalty he did not quite trust. Juan de Cartagena in particular, who was appointed by the crown as a watchdog, showed a hostile attitude early on. It was obvious that he questioned Magellan's authority and tried to curry favor with the crew. Despite these tensions, the start of the journey was orderly. The ships set course for the Canary Islands, which traditionally served as the first stopover. There, supplies were replenished, water was replenished, and information about possible Portuguese activities was obtained. Magellan knew that his homeland would do everything it could to hinder his expedition. In fact, Portuguese envoys at the court of Charles I had tried to prevent the voyage, and it was not excluded that the fleet could be stopped at sea. From the Canary Islands, the Armada sailed further south, along the African coast to Cape Verde, before heading westwards. The passage across the Atlantic was a first test. Storms could occur at any time, and navigation was difficult. Magellan used the compass, the astrolabe, and the knowledge of the trade winds that Columbus and his successors had already used. Nevertheless, every day at sea remained a challenge, and the men had to get used to the monotonous life in a confined space. The departure from Seville and the crossing of the Atlantic were more than just stages of a long journey. They marked the beginning of an undertaking that could decide not only the fate of the men but also the future of Spain and Portugal. For Charles I it was a prestige project, for Magellan a personal mission, and for the crew a journey into the unknown. The fleet was now on its way to South America, a continent whose coasts were already known, but whose interior and possible passages to the west were still a secret. Magellan hoped to find a passage there that would lead him into the ocean beyond the continent. His dream of a western route to the Moluccas thus took concrete shape. Every day that the ships sailed further west brought him closer to realizing a vision he had tried in vain to realize in Portugal. The departure from Seville in 1519 was therefore more than just a logistical starting point. It was the beginning of one of the greatest journeys in human history. The 5 ships that sailed out of the harbor into the infinity of the Atlantic carried not only men and supplies, but also the hope, knowledge, and ambitions of an entire era. Magellan was at their head, a man who put all his eggs in one basket and was ready to seek his destiny in the unknown expanses of the world. Chapter 9. The Journey Across the Atlantic, First Stages, Problems, and Hopes. The crossing of the Atlantic was the first major test for Ferdinand Magellan and his fleet. They had left Seville, sailed down the Guadalquivir, made final preparations at San Lucar de Barrameda, and then sailed out to the open sea in September 1519. They had a journey of weeks, perhaps months, ahead of them, and the uncertainty weighed heavier than the physical strain. Although the experience of Columbus and his successors had shown that the passage across the Atlantic was possible, the ocean remained a dangerous, unpredictable element. For the men on board, it meant hunger, thirst, disease, and the constant threat of storms or navigational errors. Magellan first headed for the Canary Islands, a familiar stopover for trips to the New World. There he replenished supplies, especially water and fresh food, and took the opportunity to obtain news of the movements of Portuguese ships. Because he knew that his home country considered him a traitor and might be trying to stop his expedition. Portugal had already protested against his trip and considered any approach by Spain to the Moluccas as a violation of the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Portuguese were known for their efficiency in tracking down and eliminating unwelcome competitors. But the news Magellan received was reassuring. There was no danger in the immediate vicinity. From the Canary Islands, the fleet sailed south, along the African coast to near Cape Verde, before turning westwards. This is where the actual ocean crossing began. The trade winds, which blew steadily from the northeast, helped the ships to set course for the coasts of South America. Magellan relied on his knowledge of the winds and currents he had gained during his years in Portuguese service. The sails were filled, and the fleet made good progress. But even with favorable winds, life on board was hard. The confinement on the ships was oppressive. Dozens of men slept close together on hard planks. The air was filled with smoke, sweat, and mold. Rats and vermin made the supplies undrinkable, and the drinking water began to rot in the barrel after only a few days. Scurvy, the dreaded disease resulting from vitamin deficiency, was a constant companion, even if its causes were not yet understood. After the first few weeks, some men showed swollen gum lines and open wounds that did not heal. Magellan maintained strict discipline to maintain morale. The daily routine was fixed: work on sails and rigging, cleaning the deck, serving food, guarding in shifts. The sound of the ship's bell determined the rhythm, and prayers were just as much a part of it as military order. Anyone who disobeyed orders or instigated quarrels was severely punished. Magellan knew that even small indisciplines could lead to mutiny. He was particularly careful that the Spanish captains did not find an opportunity to undermine his authority. Juan de Cartagena, the royal watchdog, remained an outspoken critic, and his attempts to sow doubt among the men continued. Despite the hardships at sea, the men also experienced moments of amazement. The endless ocean, the changing colors of the sky, the sight of flying fish and dolphins offered variety. On clear nights, the stars twinkled with an intensity that was new to many. They were indispensable helpers for the navigators. Using astrolabes and Jacob staffs, they measured the height of the sun and stars to determine the latitude. The longitudes, on the other hand, remained an unsolved problem, so that the distance to the west could only be estimated. From Brazil, the fleet sailed further south. The real purpose of the journey was now clear: to seek the mysterious passage that Magellan was convinced to find at the southern end of the continent. But the men didn't know anything for sure and began to doubt. Rumors circulated that there was no such passage and that Magellan was leading it to its doom. The Portuguese countered, showed determination, and promised that success was only a matter of time. The journey across the Atlantic was therefore not only a physical crossing, but also a psychological test. Every day at sea gnawed at the patience of the men. The endless expanse of the sea, the monotony of everyday life, and the uncertainty about the destination created tensions. Magellan not only had to master navigation, but also secure the trust of the crew. His demeanor, his calmness, and his severity made an impression, but the cracks in the relationship with his captains became more apparent. At the same time, the Atlantic was an ocean that raised hope. For the men who knew Columbus' discoveries, the crossing was associated with the expectation that wealth and adventure awaited beyond the water. They knew about the gold finds in the New World, about exotic animals and plants. Even though supplies became scarce and the effort weighed heavily on them, the idea that fame and fortune beckoned in the end remained a strong motivation. For Magellan himself, this first major stage was an opportunity to consolidate his leadership role. He demonstrated organizational talent by dividing up supplies sparingly and keeping the ships in a convoy. He showed determination by staying the course and not letting doubts distract him. Above all, however, he proved to the men that he knew what he was doing. The Atlantic had been crossed, Brazil had been reached, and the fleet was now sailing along the unknown coasts of South America. The crossing had left its mark on the men. Some were broken by the hardships, others were steeled. But everyone knew that the adventure had only just begun. The Atlantic Ocean was behind them, but the real trials were still ahead of them. The long winter in Patagonia, the dreaded mutiny, and finally the search for the passage that would open access to the great ocean. Magellan was determined to realize his dream, and the Atlantic had been the first step that brought him closer to that goal. Chapter 10: Winter in Patagonia, Mutiny and Hardship in a Foreign Country. After leaving the Brazilian coast behind Magellan's fleet, it set its course further south. The goal was clear. They were looking for the mysterious passage that would lead to the west, that access to the ocean that no one had found before, and that would open the way to the Moluccas for Magellan and Spain. But the further south the ships sailed, the more inhospitable and alien the world became. The coasts were lined with endless plains and barren landscapes, the winds became rougher, the weather more unpredictable. This is where the hardest phase of the journey so far began: the long winter in Patagonia. In March 1520, the fleet reached the Bay of San Julian, a sheltered bay on the coast of present-day Argentina. Magellan decided to spend the winter there. It was a pragmatic decision, because supplies were running out, the men were exhausted, and the winter in these latitudes hardly allowed them to continue. But wintering brought new dangers. For months, the men had to stay in a strange place, cut off from the world, with scarce supplies and no distractions. In this narrowness and uncertainty, mistrust and dissatisfaction grew. It soon became apparent how deep the mistrust of Magellan was among the Spanish officers. Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis de Mendoza, the captains of 3 ships, openly questioned Magellan's authority. They accused him of leading the expedition to ruin, and they emphasized that as a Portuguese he did not have the right to rule over Spaniards. Behind these accusations was not only personal pride, but also the fear that the journey would fail and they would all perish. The tensions erupted in an open mutiny. During the night, the rebellious captains occupied their ships, declared Magellan deposed, and tried to get the crew on their side. It was a risky undertaking, because if the mutiny succeeded, Magellan would have lost his power and probably his life. But the Portuguese proved in this crisis the toughness and determination that characterized him. Magellan reacted with cunning and violence. At first, he secretly sent loyalists to the ship of the mutineers, who boarded under the pretext of negotiations. In a sudden coup d'état, they took control and killed Mendoza, one of the leaders. Then Magellan cleverly used his own superiority to intimidate the other ships. He aimed his ships at the rebels with cannons and threatened annihilation. In the face of this determination, resistance collapsed. The mutiny was crushed. The punishment for the insurgents was harsh and was intended to set an example. Gaspar de Quesada was executed, Juan de Cartagena and another officer were abandoned, left to their fate in the Patagonian wilderness. This was a shock for the crew, but also a clear signal. Magellan would not tolerate rebellion, and his authority was inviolable. In the midst of Patagonia's isolation, he showed that he was capable of ruling with an iron fist. But even after the mutiny was suppressed, conditions in San Julian remained harsh. The cold took its toll on the men, storms whipped the ships, and supplies dwindled. The diet consisted mainly of hard bread, which was riddled with worms, and meat, which soon spoiled. Water became scarce, and scurvy began to claim victims. Men died, and morale sank. Many wondered if the expedition had not long since been cursed. During this time, there were also encounters with the indigenous people of the region, who were later referred to by Europeans as Patagonians. They were tall in stature, dressed in animal skins, and their strange appearance aroused wonder and fear. Magellan tried to make contact with them, exchange gifts and gain information about the area. But communication was difficult, and tensions soon arose. Reports from later chroniclers describe how some of these encounters ended in violence. For the men on board, the giants of Patagonia were another sign that they had entered a strange, dangerous world. Despite the hardships, Magellan stuck to his goal. He knew that he was only at the beginning of the decisive stage. Winter was a test, and he saw it as his task to keep the men going until conditions allowed them to continue. His steadfastness impressed some, but for many he remained a stranger, a Portuguese who risked their lives. In May 1520, Magellan sent the Santiago to explore the coast further south. The ship, however, got caught in a storm and crashed into the rocks. The few survivors dragged themselves back to San Julian and reported on the disaster. The loss of a ship was a heavy blow, both morally and practically. Now only 4 ships remained, and the men felt that resources were becoming increasingly scarce. The months in Patagonia were a test of strength. Hunger, disease, cold and mistrust made the time a torture. But Magellan did not give up. With iron discipline, he led the men through the darkness of winter until the first signs of spring appeared in September. Then at last he gave the order to weigh anchor and continue the voyage southwards. Winter in Patagonia was a turning point. He showed how dangerous the expedition was and how thin the line between obedience and mutiny could be. But he also revealed Magellan's character, his toughness, his determination, and his willingness to make even cruel decisions to save the mission. For many men he was a tyrant, for others a leader who was able to enforce the impossible. As the ships left San Julian and sailed further south, everyone knew that they had only survived by the will and rigor of their commander. But the real trials were yet to come. The search for the passage, the crossing of the unknown ocean, and finally the encounter with the islands that were their real destination. Winter in Patagonia was only a preview of the deprivations that were to come. Chapter 11. The discovery of the Strait of Magellan, breakthrough to the Pacific. After the long months of deprivation in the Patagonian winter camp, Magellan left the Bay of San Julian in September 1520. The frost slowly gave way to the first signs of spring, the days grew longer, and the men drew new hope, even if they were weakened by hunger, disease, and the lost Santiago. Now the decisive stage lay ahead of them. The search for the mysterious passage that was to connect the unknown sea in the west with the Atlantic. For Magellan, it was the core of his mission, proof that his vision was right. Without such a passage, the entire expedition would have failed. The fleet sailed further down the coast of South America, deeper and deeper into regions unknown to Europeans. The landscapes changed. Endless plains, whipped by winds, followed by rugged coasts and snow-capped mountains that rose out of the sea like mighty walls. It was a barren, inhospitable world that instilled respect in men. They had the feeling that they had penetrated the edge of the earth, where the forces of nature and loneliness dominated. On October 21, 1520, the fleet reached a large bay, which was later called Bahia de las Once Mil Virgins. Magellan let the ship sail in and began to explore the waterways. Soon the men realized that they were in a labyrinth of canals, islands, and fjords. Strong winds and currents made navigation difficult, but the prospect of a passage to the west made all deprivations forgotten for a moment. Was this the long-awaited passage? Magellan showed great caution during this phase. He kept the ships in formation, sent smaller boats to explore the tributaries, and made sure that they did not advance too quickly into unknown waters. Nevertheless, a momentous incident occurred. The San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet, secretly separated and returned to Spain. The officers on board had decided that the risk was too great and that Magellan was a fool who was leading them all to their doom. For Magellan, the loss was a heavy blow, because he lost not only a ship, but also a large part of the supplies. But he was not deterred. He saw the desertion as a betrayal, but at the same time as a relief. Those who did not believe in him were not to remain on board. The remaining 4 ships fought their way through the labyrinth. Day after day they felt their way forward, always accompanied by storms, rain, and icy winds. The men suffered, but the hope of reaching the ocean soon kept them alive. And indeed, after weeks of travel, a vastness appeared at the end of the waterway that was unlike anything they had seen before. In front of them lay an ocean, calm and endless, without the high waves and storms they had experienced in the Atlantic and in the passage. It was November 28, 1520, when Magellan made the breakthrough. For the first time, Europeans sailed into the Pacific Ocean from the east. For Magellan, this was the moment of triumphant confirmation. His vision had been fulfilled, the passage existed, and he had found it. The strait that would henceforth bear his name, the Strait of Magellan, became a symbol of his courage and tenacity. The men, exhausted and marked by the hardships, could hardly believe what they had achieved. They had opened a gate that had been locked until then. They stood on the threshold of an ocean that no European had crossed before. Little did they know how vast and immense this ocean was, but at that moment joy prevailed. Magellan himself was filled with deep gratitude. He had a mass read to thank God for the safe passage. For him, the discovery was not only a geographical triumph, but also spiritual proof that his mission was guided by divine will. The crew, though exhausted, shared his pride at that moment. They knew they had become part of something bigger, something that would change the world forever. The Strait of Magellan proved to be as dangerous as it was decisive. The labyrinth of canals, fjords, and islands stretched over more than 500 kilometers. Fog, currents, and sudden storms made it one of the most difficult sea routes in the world. But Magellan had proven that he could master it. His determination, his knowledge, and his unwavering will had led him to places where no European had gone before. When the fleet finally drifted out into the open Pacific, the men looked back at the barren coasts of Patagonia, at the fjords and mountains that had almost swallowed them up. They had left the Atlantic behind and entered a new dimension. But they had no idea that the greatest test was yet to come. The crossing of an ocean whose dimensions they completely underestimated. For Magellan, however, the discovery of the passage was the decisive breakthrough. He now knew that his dream was realizable. The road to the Moluccas lay open, even if it might be longer and more dangerous than he had hoped. The Strait of Magellan secured his place in history, regardless of what else would happen. He was the man who had opened the gate to the Pacific, and thus the gate to circumnavigation. The passage had claimed victims, it had pushed the men to their limits, but it had also proven that courage and perseverance could make the impossible possible. The Strait of Magellan became a monument to human determination, a gate that could only be opened through suffering, hunger, mutiny, and betrayal, and yet was the key to a new age. Chapter 12. The Pacific, Hunger, Thirst, and Death on Earth's Largest Ocean. When Magellan's fleet left the passage through the Strait of Magellan behind at the end of November 1520 and sailed out into the vast, unknown sea, many men believed that the worst was now behind them. They had survived storms, ice, hunger, and mutiny, they had found a sea route that connected the continents, and they stood at the entrance to an ocean that no European had ever sailed from this side before. But what awaited them was not the hoped-for quick crossing to the Moluccas, but an ordeal of unprecedented proportions. The first crossing of the Pacific, the largest and loneliest ocean in the world, which would soon become synonymous with hunger, thirst, and death. Magellan gave the new sea the name Mare Pacificum, the Silent Sea. In fact, it initially welcomed the ships with calm seas and mild winds, a contrast to the raging storms of the Strait of Magellan. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and the waves rolled evenly. For a brief moment, the men felt relief, almost euphoria, as if they had found the blessing of heaven. But this silence was deceptive. They soon realized that this ocean was not still, but immeasurable, larger than anything they could have imagined. The supplies they had loaded on their departure from Patagonia had been scarce. Magellan had believed that the crossing would only take a few weeks. No one could have guessed that the journey would take more than 3 months without land in sight. After only a few weeks, the problems began. The water in the barrels became rotten, the bread was full of worms, the meat spoiled. The men had to eat things that were hardly considered food anymore: sawdust boiled in water, rats exchanged for astronomical sums, and pieces of leather from sails that were soaked in the sea to soften them. Magellan himself showed iron discipline and calmness in this phase. He suffered like everyone else, but he did not lose his composure. He gave clear instructions to the men, saved supplies as much as possible, and tried to spread hope. But even his authority could not prevent doubt and despair from spreading. Some murmured that the ocean was endless, that they were trapped in a trap that God had set for them. Others spoke of curse and punishment. Only a few held on to the belief that they would reach land in the end. Day after day passed, week after week, without a piece of coastline appearing on the horizon. The immensity of the Pacific exceeded imagination. The navigators, working with astrolabes and compasses, tried to determine the location, but the estimates were inaccurate. Nobody knew how far you had sailed. Nobody knew how far it was. This uncertainty wore the men down almost more than hunger and disease. The fleet lost many men during this time. Some gave up quietly, lay down and died, others fell into madness. There was a pungent stench of rot, sweat and disease on board. The rats were hunted until none were to be found, and the water in the barrels stank so much that it could hardly be drunk, but the choice was between disgust and death. Magellan, who always tried to maintain order, had to realize that he could not overcome the laws of nature. After 3 endless months, salvation came. In March 1521, the fleet finally reached the Mariana Islands, more precisely the island of Guam. When the men saw land again after such a long time, a jubilation broke out that no one had thought possible. They threw themselves on the ground, kissed the sand, drank greedily fresh water, and filled their bellies with fruits they had been deprived of for months. The encounter with the locals was friendly at first, but soon conflicts arose when the inhabitants of the island stole supplies from the ships. Magellan responded with harshness and violence to restore order, but the most important lesson of this stopover was that they had survived the Pacific. Crossing the Pacific was an unprecedented achievement. It showed not only the greatness and relentlessness of nature, but also the willpower of people pushed to the edge of the possible. For the men who survived, it was an experience they never forgot. For Magellan, it was the fulfillment of his vision. He had proven that the Earth could be navigated from west to east and that the Moluccas were in principle accessible. But the price was terrible. Of the original more than 270 men, dozens had already died, and many more were weakened and ill. The fleet was decimated, supplies exhausted, morale broken. The Pacific had proven to be the greatest enemy, an ocean that had shown its greatness and relentlessness in full force. Nevertheless, this moment was of triumphant importance. Magellan had achieved something that no European had done before. He was the first to cross the Pacific from east to west, and in doing so, he had redrawn the map of the world. Even though the journey was far from over and the greatest challenges were still to come, the passage across the Pacific was a historic victory over nature, a testament to courage, perseverance, and the unwavering power of human vision. Chapter 13. Arriving in the Philippines, New Hope and Encounters. After Magellan's fleet had survived the martyrdom of the Pacific and reached the island of Guam with the last of its strength, the relief was great, but it was short-lived. The encounter with the inhabitants of the Mariana Islands was overshadowed by conflict, and the men knew that they needed new supplies and a safe haven to continue their journey. Magellan, who despite his own weakness showed himself to be an unwavering leader, let the fleet sail on, always in search of new islands that promised food, water, and peace. A few weeks later, they came across a group of islands that would play a decisive role in the history of the expedition: the Philippines. In March 1521, the ships reached the island of Homenhan, east of Samar. The exhausted men were suspicious at first, because they did not know how the residents would react. But to her relief, the encounter turned out to be friendly. Fishermen from the surrounding area brought them coconuts, fish, palm wine, and rice. For the sailors, who had been suffering from hunger and scurvy for months, this was like a miracle. Many men recovered quickly, their strength returned, and for the first time in a long time, something like hope spread. Magellan himself saw in this encounter more than just an opportunity for recreation. He recognized that these islands could be strategically important, both as a station on the way to the Moluccas and as a potential sphere of influence for Spain. He therefore deliberately sought contact with the local rulers in order not only to secure supplies, but also to forge political alliances. The expedition took on a new dimension here. It was no longer just a geographical project, but also an act of imperial expansion. The meeting with Raja Kalambu and Raja Siagu, local rulers of Limasawa, was particularly significant. They received Magellan and his men with respect and curiosity. An exchange of gifts ensued, and Magellan had diplomatic talks held with the help of his interpreter Enrique, a slave of Malay origin who had been at his side for years. Enrique proved to be indispensable because he was able to understand the language of the locals and thus formed a bridge between cultures. On March 31, 1521, a mass was celebrated on Limassol, the first in this region. Magellan saw this as a great success. He was able to bring the Christian faith to Asia, just as the Spanish king and the church had hoped. For the locals, this was a strange spectacle, but they received it kindly, and some even showed interest in the new faith. For Magellan, this was a sign that his mission was not only to discover geographically, but also to spread Christianity. From Limassol, the fleet sailed to Cebu, where it encountered Raja Humabon. This ruler received Magellan with great pomp and was ready to enter into an alliance with the Spaniards. Magellan understood that he had a chance to accomplish more than just a temporary supply. He established close relationships, convinced Humabon and many of his followers to embrace Christianity, and had them baptized. It was a symbolic moment. For the first time, a larger group of islanders in this region was introduced to the Christian faith. Magellan showed a mixture of diplomacy and religious zeal in these encounters. He appeared as a representative of the Spanish king, as a bearer of the Christian faith and at the same time as an experienced navigator. To the locals, who were fascinated by the foreign ships, weapons, and customs, he must have seemed like a man from another world. Many saw the alliance with the Europeans as an opportunity to strengthen their own power against rival tribes. But the first tensions were not long in coming. Magellan was convinced that he had to fulfill his mission not only through friendship, but also through the enforcement of the Spanish and Christian order. He began to get involved in local conflicts, which would prove to be a momentous mistake. When he learned that a neighboring chief named Lapu-Lapu refused to recognize Spanish authority and embrace Christianity, he decided to intervene militarily. For Magellan, it was a matter of honor and a proof of his determination. For his men, however, it was an unnecessary risk that involved them in battles that had nothing to do with the actual goal of the expedition, the Moluccas. Despite these tensions, the period in the Philippines remained a period of relative recovery. The men strengthened themselves with fresh food, their health improved, and the feeling of having finally found land and allies again gave them new courage. Magellan himself felt vindicated in his role. He was not only a seafarer, but a conqueror, a diplomat, a missionary. The Philippines gave him the stage on which he could play all these roles at the same time. But the hope that had germinated in the weeks after their arrival in the Philippines was soon to be mixed with new danger. The involvement in local power struggles, the rivalry between the tribes and the growing dependence on Magellan's interpreter Enrique, whose loyalty began to falter, made the situation increasingly precarious. The expedition was far from its original destination, the ships were weakened, and the men knew that every day they stayed here took them further away from the Moluccas. The arrival in the Philippines was therefore a moment of hope and at the same time the beginning of a new, dangerous phase. It gave the men strength, it made Magellan feel that he was fulfilling a mission that went far beyond the search for spices. But it also sowed the seeds of conflict that would soon end in disaster. Chapter 14. Conflicts and the Death of Magellan, the Battle of Mactan. The weeks following the fleet's arrival in the Philippines were marked by a mixture of recovery, diplomatic successes, and growing unrest. Magellan had formed an alliance with Raja Humabon of Cebu that provided him not only with food, water, and rest, but also with the opportunity to establish Spain's authority in the region. With the baptism of the Raja, his wife, and many of his followers, Magellan saw a huge step taken. The Christian mission seemed to be working, and he was later able to report to Charles I that he had not only circumnavigated the world, but had also won souls for the faith. But what was a triumph for Magellan was also the beginning of new conflicts. The Philippines was not a unified political structure, but a network of rival tribal societies competing for influence, trade, and honor. Humabon was just one of many local rulers, and his alliance with the Spanish was met with suspicion and rejection by others. In particular, Lapu-Lapu, a chief of Mactan, an island near Cebu, refused to recognize the supremacy of Humabon or the authority of foreign Europeans. To him, the Spaniards were invaders whose weapons and ships posed a threat, and he refused to be baptized or pay tributes. Magellan was thus faced with a decision that revealed more about his character than about political necessities. He could have ignored Lapu-Lapu's refusal and continued the journey to the Moluccas, because his real mission was not to subjugate the Philippines, but to find the sea route to the Spice Islands. But his pride, his missionary zeal, and perhaps his desire to prove to Humabon that he was a reliable ally led him to choose a different path. He decided to subjugate Lapu-Lapu by force. In the night of April 26 to 27, 1521, Magellan sailed from Cebu to Mactan with about 60 men. Only a small troop accompanied him, while many Spaniards remained on the ships. He trusted in the superiority of his weapons, swords, crossbows, and muskets, and underestimated the strength of the native warriors. When the Spaniards landed early in the morning, They were faced with more than 1,000 fighters armed with bamboo spears, shields, and poisoned arrows. The Battle of Mactan began unhappily for the Europeans. Their cannons could not be used due to the distance from the beach, and the muskets, while deadly, were slow to reload. Lapu-Lapu's warriors rushed towards the Spaniards in large numbers, using their mobility and knowledge of the terrain. Magellan tried to keep his men in formation, but they soon found themselves in trouble. The Spaniards were heavily armored, which hindered them in close combat, while the islanders fought light-footedly and attacked again and again. Magellan himself fought on the front line. He fended off attacks, tried to keep his men together, and struck around with sword and lance. But soon a poisoned arrow hit him in the leg, weakening him. Further wounds followed until he finally fell to the ground. The warriors of Mactan pounced on him, and despite his desperate resistance, he was overwhelmed. He fell in battle, surrounded by enemies, and his men had to retreat without being able to recover his body. This was a shock for the survivors. Their leader, the man who had led them across the Atlantic, through the Strait of Magellan, and across the Pacific, was dead. They had experienced him as strict, sometimes tyrannical, but also unshakable. Now he was in the hands of opponents who celebrated him as the winner. Magellan's death changed everything. The expedition had not yet reached its destination, but it was now leaderless and weakened. The consequences were immediate. Raja Humabon, who had previously been a close ally, began to doubt. Without Magellan, Spanish authority was weakened, and the locals realized that the foreigners were not invincible. Soon new hostilities broke out, and the alliance broke up. Several Spaniards were killed in a party that served as a trap, and the situation of the expedition became increasingly precarious. For the men who survived Magellan, the defeat of Mactan was a bitter lesson. They had learned that their weapons and discipline were not always enough to overcome the numerical superiority and determination of local fighters. They had seen that their leader was fallible, that his pride and impatience could lead them to disaster. But they also knew that they had to sail on if they wanted to survive. The Battle of Mactan was the end of Magellan's personal journey, but not the end of the expedition. His dream lived on in the ships that now set off without him to reach the Moluccas. The men who survived him were faced with a choice: give up and return to Spain, or complete the mission and find the Spice Islands. They chose the latter, even though they now knew that the price would be high. Magellan's death was tragic, but it was also symbolic. He did not fall in a naval battle against a European fleet, not in a storm or disease, but in a fight against people who were defending their homeland. Its end showed that the encounter between Europe and the non-European world meant not only trade and mission, but also violence, misunderstandings, and bloodshed. For posterity, the Battle of Mactan became a turning point. It showed the limits of European power in this early phase of expansion, but it also made Magellan a legendary figure. He had discovered the Pacific, opened up the world in a new way, and he had given his life before he could experience the final triumph. His death transformed him from a controversial commander to a martyr of the history of discovery, and the expedition that sailed on without him carried his name into immortality. Chapter 15. Continuing the journey without the leader, the Moluccas and the return to Spain. Magellan's death on the island of Mactan in April 1521 was a deep cut in the history of the expedition. The man who had had the vision, who had carried her across the seas, carried her through hunger, cold, and mutiny, had fallen. For many of the survivors, it was as if the soul of the enterprise had been lost. But the journey was not over. The treaty with the Spanish crown obliged them to find their way to the Moluccas, and despite all the setbacks, there were enough men among the officers who were determined to carry out the mission. First, however, order had to be brought to the chaos. After Magellan's death, there was disagreement among the captains. Who should take command? The officers eventually elected Duarte Barbosa and Juan Serrano as new leaders. But the rivalries within the ruling class weakened the expedition. The alliance with Raja Humabon, once considered secure, finally broke down after Magellan's death. A feast to which Humabon invited the Spaniards ended in a bloodbath in which many of the officers, including Barbosa and Serrano, were killed. Only through luck and quick escape did the remaining men escape destruction. The losses were devastating. Of the original 5 ships and almost 270 men, only 3 ships and less than 120 sailors remained. The mood was one of desperation, but the men knew they had no choice. A return to Spain without fulfilling the mission would have meant shame and possibly death, as the crown would have condemned her as a failure. The Moluccas had to be reached, whatever the cost. The journey took the remaining ships further west, across the Visayas and Mindanao archipelagos, until they reached the Moluccas in November 1521. Finally, they stood at the destination, which had been the real reason for the expedition from the beginning. The Spice Islands, especially Tidor and Ternate, have been centers of global trade for centuries. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace grew here, precious goods that were weighed in gold in Europe. For the surviving men, it was a moment of triumph. Despite all adversities, despite hunger, disease, betrayal, and death, they had reached the Moluccas. The inhabitants of Tidor welcomed the Spaniards with open arms, not least because they saw the Europeans as a counterweight to the Portuguese, who already had close relations with Ternate. The Sultan of Tidor, Almansa, concluded an alliance with the Spaniards, which assured them of trade rights and support. This was a blessing for the men of the fleet. They were able to fill the holds of their ships with the longed-for spices and supply themselves with fresh water and food. But the expedition was not yet saved. 2 ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria, were to start their journey home, while the third ship, the Concepcion, was abandoned due to poor condition and burned so that it would not fall into the hands of the Portuguese. The Trinidad tried to make its way back across the Pacific, but failed due to storms, disease, and Portuguese resistance. Many of their men fell into captivity, and the ship itself was abandoned. Only the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, remained. Elcano was an experienced sailor from the Basque Country who had shown loyalty and skill during the expedition. He decided to take the risky way back across the Indian Ocean, even though it was controlled by the Portuguese. On December 21, 1521, the Victoria left Tidor, loaded with precious carnations and with only about 60 men on board. The journey home was an ordeal. The Victoria first sailed south, along the coast of Timor, before crossing the Indian Ocean. The route took them past the Cape of Good Hope, the point that the Portuguese held firmly within their sphere of influence. Storms whipped the ship, supplies ran out, diseases killed more men. But Elcano showed extraordinary courage and strategic skill by avoiding the Portuguese ports and leading the fleet back to Europe in a wide arc. On September 6, 1522, the Victoria reached Seville after almost 3 years. Of the original almost 270 men, only 18 survivors returned. They were emaciated, sick and marked by deprivation, but they had achieved something that had never been achieved before. They had circumnavigated the earth. Their arrival was greeted with astonishment and jubilation in Seville. Magellan's dream had become reality, even if he himself had not lived to see it. The return of the Victoria was a triumph for Spain. The cargo of cloves and nutmeg was so valuable that it covered the costs of the entire expedition and even brought in profit. Above all, however, it was a political and symbolic victory. Spain was now able to prove that the world was indeed circumnavigable and that the Moluccas, at least from the Spanish point of view, were within the sphere of influence of the crown. For Juan Sebastian Elcano, the homecoming meant fame and recognition. Charles I raised him to the nobility and awarded him a coat of arms with a globe and the inscription Primus circumdedistimi, you were the first to sail around me. Elcano had completed what Magellan had begun and thus saved the expedition. But Magellan's shadow remained over everything. Without him, the journey would never have begun. Without his vision and his unwavering will, the men would never have found the Strait of Magellan, never crossed the Pacific, never reached the Philippines. His death in Mactan was tragic, but his name lived on in the expedition. Even though Elcano completed the circumnavigation, it was Magellan who went down in history as the great explorer. The onward journey without the leader was a testament to the resilience and will to survive of the men who had survived him. They showed that even without the visionary guide, the expedition could continue. But it was also a bitter testimony to the losses and sacrifices that this undertaking had claimed. Out of 5 ships, only 1 returned, and out of hundreds of men, only a few. The journey to the Moluccas and the return to Spain were the crowning glory of an odyssey that changed the world. They showed that the earth was round, that its oceans were connected, and that the dream of circumnavigating the world could become a reality. But they also showed the price people were willing to pay to gain fame, fortune, and knowledge. Chapter 16. The Legacy of Circumnavigation, Implications for Geography and Trade. When the Victoria returned to Seville in September 1522, the world was no longer the same. The first circumnavigation of the Earth had proven what had previously only existed in theories and conjectures, that the Earth was indeed round and that its oceans were connected. Although scholars had assumed the spherical shape of the Earth since antiquity, there was no practical proof. Magellan's expedition, even if he did not complete it himself, had provided this definitive proof and thus fundamentally changed the geographical view of the world. For the people of Europe, the news of the return of the Victoria was like a thunderclap. Contemporaries described it as a miracle, as a triumph of human audacity over nature. But the consequences went far beyond amazement. The circumnavigation of the world marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of trade, politics, and science. The globe, which had previously only existed in abstract maps, became tangible reality. One of the most immediate consequences concerned geography. The world maps that had been made up to that point were full of gaps and errors. America was only known in parts, and the dimensions of the Pacific were completely underestimated. Now the maps had to be fundamentally revised. The Pacific turned out to be far larger than anyone had ever suspected. The distances between the continents, the connections between the Atlantic and the Pacific, all this has been re-entered. Cosmographers and cartographers in Seville, Lisbon, and other centers worked feverishly to incorporate the new findings. The Earth took on a new shape, and the knowledge of its size and diversity changed the way people think. Trade was also revolutionized by circumnavigation. Until then, the Portuguese had controlled the sea route to India and the Moluccas via the Cape of Good Hope. The Spaniards had opened up America through Columbus, but they were denied direct access to the Spice Islands. Magellan's route, as difficult and costly as it was, now opened up a second possibility, even if it was not used regularly at first. The spices that the Victoria brought to Seville, cloves, nutmeg, and mace, were of such high value that they covered the costs of the entire expedition and made a profit. This made it clear how lucrative the trade in these products was and how crucial access to the Moluccas would remain. The rivalry between Spain and Portugal thus reached a new peak. Both empires claimed the Moluccas for themselves, based on different interpretations of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Portugal argued that the islands were within its sphere of influence, while Spain insisted that they were west of the agreed line. There were diplomatic tensions and even minor military conflicts, which were only settled by the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529. In it, Portugal secured supremacy over the Moluccas in exchange for a large payment, while Spain concentrated on the Philippines. This reordered the world not only geographically, but also politically. The economic consequences were just as significant. The proof that the Earth could be circumnavigated opened up new perspectives for global trade. Spain, and later other European powers, realized that it was possible to transport goods on routes around the entire world. Although the Magellan route through the Pacific initially remained too dangerous and costly, it was the beginning of a global trade network that became increasingly dense in the centuries that followed. The expedition was a milestone for science. It not only proved the spherical shape of the Earth, but also provided information about its size. Many were surprised at how vast the oceans were and how small the land masses appeared in comparison. The expedition's experience provided data on currents, winds, flora, and fauna in remote regions. Reports about unknown animals, plants, and peoples were included in the chronicles and expanded Europe's knowledge of the diversity of the world. Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler of the journey, played a key role in this. His records not only provided geographical information, but also described the cultures, languages, and customs of the people the expedition had encountered. Europe's self-image also changed. Circumnavigating the world was more than a geographical act, it was a symbol of the beginning of a global epoch. Europe now saw itself in a position to dominate the world, traverse its oceans, and exploit its resources. The claim to world domination that was made in the following centuries by Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands found one of its origins here. The expedition had shown that human will and technical skills could be sufficient to break the boundaries of the known world. But the legacy of circumnavigating the world was not only triumphant. It was also a sign of the violence, oppression, and exploitation that was to characterize the colonial era. The encounters with the peoples of Patagonia, Guam, the Philippines, and the Moluccas showed that Europe's expansion was rarely peaceful. Missionary work, trade, and political alliances went hand in hand with coercion, fraud, and military force. Magellan's death in Mactan was proof that not everyone was willing to accept the strangers, and that resistance was met with blood. The empire that emerged from these beginnings was built on a foundation of power that was as destructive as it was creative. For Spain, the expedition remained a unique triumph, even if the immediate benefit was limited. The Philippines, which became a Spanish colony in the following decades, was an indirect heir to Magellan. The Moluccas, on the other hand, fell to Portugal. But the prestige, the honor, the memory that Spain was the first to circumnavigate the Earth, remained immortal. Magellan, although he himself did not return, became a legend. From then on, his name stood for courage, determination, and vision. Circumnavigating the world changed not only maps, trade, and politics, but also thinking. It made the Earth smaller and larger at the same time. It showed that the world was a cohesive whole, in which all oceans and continents were part of a single entity. This realization was the beginning of a global network that continues to the present day. Chapter 17. Magellan's posthumous glory, from betrayal to hero worship. When Ferdinand Magellan fell on the island of Mactan in April 1521, he was by no means the celebrated hero he would later become in the eyes of many of his contemporaries. For the Portuguese crown, he was considered a traitor who had made his knowledge and skills available to rival Spain. Even in Spain, where his expeditions sailed under the flag of Charles I, his reputation was initially ambivalent. Some officers and survivors saw him as a tyrannical leader who, through stubbornness and hubris, had driven the men into dangers that could have been avoided. But history had its own way of shaping the image of a person, and so Magellan transformed over the centuries from a controversial figure to a symbol of courage, discovery, and human history. Immediately after Victoria's return to Seville, it was not Magellan, but Juan Sebastian Elcano who was the center of attention. Elcano had saved the expedition, he had sailed around the Earth to perfection and had brought proof that the Earth was indeed round and the oceans were connected. The king rewarded him, and in the official reports he was celebrated as the accomplisher of the great venture. Magellan's role almost faded into the background. His death on Mactan made him appear not as a triumphant, but as a fallen man whose vision had only been completed by others. But soon chroniclers and scholars began to focus on Magellan. Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler of the voyage, wrote vividly in his notes about the courage and determination of the Portuguese captain. Even though Pigafetta was critical of some of his decisions, he emphasized that without Magellan's indomitable will, the expedition would never have come this far. Pigafetta's work, which was distributed in several European languages, had a decisive influence on Magellan's image. In Portugal, on the other hand, he remained an ostracized figure for a long time. The Portuguese court could not forgive him for his betrayal, and his role was played down or concealed in official historiography. It was only much later, when national borders became less important and people looked back on the great personalities of the history of discovery, that Portugal also began to pay tribute to him as one of his great sons, even though he had fallen in the service of Spain. For a long time, posterity had a hard time classifying Magellan. Was he an ambitious adventurer who led his crew to ruin? Was he a religious fanatic who wanted to suppress other cultures in the name of Christianity? Or was he a visionary pioneer who broke the boundaries of the known world more courageously than anyone else? Depending on the era and political context, it was interpreted differently. In the 16th and 17th centuries, he was seen in Spain above all as an instrument of God's plan, as someone who had accomplished the will of God by carrying the Christian faith to distant lands and revealing the earth as God's creation in all its form. In this view, his death was almost a martyr's death. He fell because he defended the faith and honor of the king. In the Age of Enlightenment, the scientific and geographical aspects were given greater prominence. Magellan was now honored as an explorer and navigator whose journey pushed the boundaries of knowledge. His name stood for reason, courage, and the power of knowledge. The heroic exaltation receded somewhat, but his rank as an explorer was consolidated. In the 19th century, when nation-states were looking for their heroes, Magellan was rediscovered in both Portugal and Spain. Portugal emphasized his Sabrosa origins and his youth at court. Spain celebrated him as the leader of one of their greatest expeditions. Monuments were erected, streets, ships, and institutions named after him. The rivalry between the two countries was reflected in the question of who belonged to Magellan, Portugal as his country of birth or Spain as his employer. Magellan also remained present in the collective memory in the Philippines, but there he was less a hero than an occupier. For many Filipinos, it symbolized the beginning of colonial rule, the subjugation and Christianization of their country. Especially the memory of Lapu-Lapu, the leader of Mactan, was cherished. In the national myths of the Philippines, Lapu-Lapu is considered the first hero to defend himself against foreign rule, while Magellan remained the invader who met his end there. This perspective shows that Magellan's posthumous fame was not interpreted in the same way everywhere, but was closely linked to the history of the respective region. Finally, in the modern era, Magellan became a global figure. His journey symbolized the beginning of a networked world, the birth of an epoch in which humanity could be understood as a unit. In school textbooks, encyclopedias, and popular accounts, he was placed alongside Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and James Cook in the ranks of the great explorers. His name became synonymous with courage and perseverance. But at the same time, the ambivalence remained. In scientific works, the dark sides of his expedition were increasingly emphasized. The violence against locals, the ruthless interventions in local power structures, the brutal disciplining of his own team. The hero Magellan has always been in the shadow of the tyrant Magellan. This field of tension makes his posthumous fame so fascinating to this day. Despite all the criticism, the greatness of his achievement cannot be denied. Magellan connected the oceans, he opened the gateway to the Pacific, he brought humanity closer to understanding its planet. The fact that he did not live to see the completion of his vision made him even more of a mythical figure. His death gave him a tragic aura that places him in line with other great figures in history who did not survive their mission, but whose work changed posterity. Today, Magellan is a name that is known far beyond the history books. A NASA spacecraft bears his name, as do craters on the Moon and Venus. Its Strait of Magellan is one of the most famous waterways in the world, and his image adorns monuments on several continents. In Portugal, he is now considered one of the country's greatest navigators, in Spain one of the most important heroes of the discovery period, and in the Philippines he is remembered as part of the colonial past, a past that is viewed critically but not deniably. Magellan's posthumous fame thus moves between betrayal and hero worship, between criticism and admiration, between European triumph and colonial trauma. Perhaps it is precisely in this ambivalence that his lasting fascination lies. He was neither a saint nor a tyrant, but a man of tremendous determination, driven by ambition and vision, who broke the boundaries of his time. Circumnavigating the world was his dream, and even if he did not complete it himself, he lives on in it, as a symbol of the human longing to transcend the unknown and dare the impossible. Chapter 18. Magellan and the Beginnings of Globalization. A New World Emerges. The first circumnavigation of the world, which ended with the return of Victoria to Seville in 1522, was much more than a geographical triumph. It marked the beginning of an era that would later be called globalization. For the first time in history, it was proven not only theoretically, but practically, that the Earth as a whole was contiguous, bypassable, and connected by trade routes. The experience gained with Magellan's expedition changed people's self-image, the functioning of trade, the politics of powers, and even the way people think about man's place in the world. The globalization that originated here was first and foremost a matter of the oceans. Europe had begun to break the boundaries of the known world in the 15th century with the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. But while Columbus discovered America and Vasco da Gama reached India by sea, Magellan connected these routes into a global line for the first time. The Earth was no longer a collection of separate spaces, but a single, interconnected system. This finding was groundbreaking. For politics, this meant that no empire, no culture, and no trading power was isolated anymore. Everything was potentially connected. Spain and Portugal immediately recognized this and began to think of their zones of influence on a global map. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which had previously only drawn an imaginary line across the Atlantic, now had to be expanded and reinterpreted to also regulate the division of the Moluccas and the Pacific. With the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, this claim was transferred to the entire world. The Earth itself had become the stage for global competition. Trade underwent an equally profound change. The cargo of the Victoria showed how valuable a global route could be. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace from the Moluccas were sold in Europe at prices that made the entire expedition a financial success, despite all its losses. Traders, merchants, and princes recognized that the future lay in global exchange. The Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Pacific were no longer insurmountable barriers, but bridges over which goods, people, and ideas could be transported. The global economy began to interconnect across oceans. But globalization was not only an economic process. It was also a cultural one. The encounters that Magellan and his men had with the peoples of Patagonia, Guam, the Philippines, and the Moluccas made it clear that humanity was more diverse and complex than Europeans had imagined. Pigafetta's chronicles tell of languages, customs, and religions that were unknown in Europe. This information not only expanded knowledge, but also challenged previous notions of the uniqueness of one's own culture. Europe began to see itself as part of a larger, more diverse humanity, even if this understanding was often accompanied by arrogance and colonial claims. The missionary dimension must not be overlooked. Magellan had considered the baptism of Raja Humabon and his followers in Cebu to be a great success, and even if it did not bring about a lasting Christianization of the Philippines in the immediate aftermath, the foundation stone had been laid. Spain began to understand religion as part of its global expansion. The Christian mission became an instrument of globalization. It combined European powers with the legitimacy to penetrate distant countries and leave them too converted. On the intellectual level, circumnavigation changed science. Cosmographers, cartographers, and scholars had to revise their models. The globe, which had previously been more of an abstract model of thought, now became a concrete representation of reality. The distance between the continents, the size of the oceans, the diversity of climatic zones, all of this had to be rethought. Man realized that his world was much larger, but also much more closely connected than previously thought. Globalization also brought with it new forms of competition and conflict. Spain and Portugal faced each other as rivals, and other European powers such as England, France, and the Netherlands were soon to follow. The race for colonies, sea routes, and trade monopolies began with Magellan, even if it did not unfold its full force until later. Without the first circumnavigation, this race would hardly have been conceivable, because it was only it that showed that all continents were part of a common playing field. At the same time, globalization has been an experience of violence and exploitation from the very beginning. The encounters in the Philippines ended in blood, the Patagonians were mocked as giants and mistreated, the inhabitants of Guam were treated as thieves. The new interconnectedness of the world was not a meeting of equals, but a confrontation in which Europe used its weapons, its religion, and its political will to gain dominance. In this sense, globalization was not only exchange, but also conquest. And yet, Magellan's journey also opened horizons of cooperation. Without the help of local rulers, without the exchange of gifts, without interpreters like Enrique, the expedition would not have survived. From the very beginning, globalization has been an interplay of violence and cooperation, of coercion and voluntary exchange, of enrichment and loss. For posterity, Magellan's expedition was the starting point of a development that continues to this day. Modern world trade, the internet, global communication, and worldwide migration, all these phenomena are ultimately rooted in the moment when the Earth was completely circumnavigated for the first time. The idea that an event in one part of the world could have an impact on another part of the world began to become concrete here. The beginnings of globalization under Magellan were thus ambivalent. They brought wealth and knowledge, but also death and oppression. They changed the thinking of Europeans and at the same time the lives of countless people in the regions that were now caught up in the maelstrom of European expansion. They showed that the world was a unity, but also that this unity could be characterized by inequality and conflict. The Victoria, which arrived in Seville with only 18 survivors, was the first symbol of this new world. Small, exhausted and scarred by the ordeal, she carried the treasures of Asia in her holds and in her logbook the proof that the world was a coherent sphere. It was the first tangible sign of globalization, which has been taking its inexorable path ever since. Chapter 19. Magellan in Cultural Memory, Literature, Art and Popular Culture. Since the return of Victoria in 1522, Ferdinand Magellan has not only remained present in the history books, but has also been anchored in the cultural memory of mankind. From the first chronicles and literary adaptations to monuments, paintings, and modern popular cultural representations, Magellan has asserted himself as a symbolic figure. He has become a myth that has been retold and reinterpreted again and again, sometimes as a heroic explorer, sometimes as a tragic hero, sometimes as a colonial conqueror. Each era has created its own version of Magellan, and so its afterlife is a reflection of changing attitudes towards discovery, expansion, and globalization. The first form of his posthumous fame took place in the writings of his contemporaries, above all Antonio Pigafetta. Pigafetta's account of the journey was not only a sober chronicle, but also a literary narrative full of details, exotic descriptions, and moral reflections. For many Europeans, his work was the first glimpse into worlds that were previously unknown. Magellan appears as a central figure, determined, sometimes tough, but always the driving force of the expedition. Pigafetta's depiction shaped the image of Magellan for centuries. In early modern literature, Magellan soon became a figure that went beyond the purely historical. Poets and writers stylized him as a symbol of human ambition and divine providence. In Spain, it was considered an instrument of heaven destined to carry the Christian message to the ends of the earth. In Portugal, on the other hand, his image was viewed ambivalently for a long time. On the one hand, he was a son of the country, on the other hand, a man who had changed sides. It was not until the 19th century that Portugal began to reclaim him as a national hero. Magellan also took up the visual arts early on. In numerous engravings, maps, and paintings from the 16th and 17th centuries, he is depicted as a serious, determined man with a compass, globe, or ship. Such depictions were often idealized and less oriented towards reality, but they made him an icon of seafaring. In the Baroque era, when the age of discoveries was glorified and heroized, Magellan often appeared in allegories alongside Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and other great navigators, as part of a pantheon of European heroes. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of nation-states, Magellan was increasingly placed at the service of nationalist views of history. In Portugal, his birth in Sabrosa was emphasized and celebrated as a proof of Portuguese seafaring, even though he had sailed under the Spanish flag. Spain, in turn, claimed him as its hero because he had begun the circumnavigation of the world on behalf of the Spanish king. This competition led to a large number of monuments, commemorative publications, and anniversary celebrations, which often said more about the political needs of the respective time than about the historical Magellan himself. The literary treatment also continued. Novels, dramas, and poems recorded Magellan's life and death. In particular, the Battle of Mactan, in which he fell, provided material for tragic stagings. Here he could appear as a martyr who died for his faith and vision, or as a victim of his own arrogance, who interfered in foreign conflicts. This two-facedness made him attractive to authors, who saw him as a projection screen for questions of power, fate, and human hubris. In the 20th century, Magellan finally became a global figure. With the great anniversaries, especially on the 400th anniversary of the Circumnavigation in 1921-22, numerous publications, films, and monuments were created. Major celebrations were held in Seville and Sabrosa, and international scholars debated its significance. At the same time, history began to be viewed from the perspective of the colonized peoples. In the Philippines, for example, Magellan was seen less as a hero and more as a symbol of colonial oppression. Lapu-Lapu, who defeated him at the Battle of Mactan, became a national hero figure there, while Magellan remained ambivalent. Magellan has also left its mark on modern popular culture. His name adorns ships, aeroplanes, and even space probes. In the 1980s, NASA named a space probe Magellan that mapped Venus, a deliberate allusion to the explorer who opened up new worlds. In science fiction literature and films, his name appears as a synonym for daring and pioneering spirit. Even in comics and children's books, he appears as an adventurer who bravely crosses the unknown expanses of the ocean. In the art of the 20th and 21st centuries, Magellan is often seen in a more critical light. Authors and artists ask about the costs of his expedition, the deaths, the suffering of the indigenous peoples, the violence inherent in the discoveries. Historians point out that circumnavigating the world was not only a triumph of knowledge, but also marked the beginning of an era of colonization and exploitation. In this perspective, Magellan no longer appears only as a hero, but also as a harbinger of European imperialism. But it is precisely this ambivalence that keeps his cultural memory alive. He is not a one-dimensional figure who is only heroized or only condemned. He is both, the visionary navigator who redrew the map of the world and the controversial conqueror who fell in a foreign war. This field of tension enables each generation to create its own Magellan, be it as a model of courage, as a warning against arrogance, or as a symbol of the interdependencies of world history. Today, Magellan can be found in school books and museums, on monuments in Europe and Asia, in street names and on stamps. His journey is told again and again in documentaries and historical novels, and it fascinates people around the world because it touches on the fundamental question of humanity. What lies beyond the horizon? Magellan embodies this question like no other. Popular culture picks it up because it stands for adventure, curiosity, and determination. At the same time, his death is a reminder that these qualities are not without risk. It stands for the longing to overcome borders and for the tragedy that such undertakings are often paid for in blood. Chapter 20. Final Reflection. Magellan between myth and history. Ferdinand Magellan is one of the figures in world history who can hardly be captured in a single picture. He was at the same time hero and traitor, visionary and tyrant, martyr and symbol of colonial violence. His name stands for the first circumnavigation of the world, an event that finally catapulted humanity into the age of global networking. And yet he himself did not live to see the completion of his mission. His life ended on a distant beach in Mactan, surrounded by opponents who rejected his claim to rule. It is precisely this break between the greatness of his vision and the tragedy of his end that makes Magellan such a fascinating figure, between myth and history. If you look at Magellan's biography, it is striking how strongly it is marked by ruptures. As a Portuguese nobleman, he first entered the service of his country's crown, took part in expeditions to India and East Africa, where he gained the experience that later enabled him to venture around the world. But after disputes and insults at the court of Lisbon, he changed sides and placed himself at the service of Spain, a decision that earned him a reputation as a traitor in Portugal. This move already shows that Magellan was not only a tool of his time, but also an ambitious man who forged his own path and was willing to give up national loyalties in favor of his vision. The expedition itself was a risk from the beginning. 5 ships with almost 270 men sailed into the unknown, burdened by rivalries between Portuguese and Spanish officers, threatened by diseases, storms, and mutinies. Magellan proved to be a determined but also tough leader. His suppression of the mutiny in Patagonia, his punishment of officers, and his iron discipline show a man who was ready to impose his authority by force. For many of his men, he was therefore a tyrant, but for others he was the only reason why the expedition was continued at all. Without his intransigence, the fleet would probably have already failed in South America. His greatest triumph was the discovery and passage of the Strait of Magellan, which was named after him. Here his unwavering belief in the existence of a western sea route to the Moluccas, his nautical experience and his ability to master the most adverse conditions were shown. The passage was a maze of storms, fog, and currents, and yet he led the ships through and opened the gate to the Pacific. This moment secured him a place in history, regardless of the fact that he himself crossed the Pacific only under unimaginable agony. The crossing of the Pacific is still one of the most impressive achievements in human history. For more than 3 months, the men sailed without a land in sight, starving, dying of thirst, suffering from scurvy, and losing many of their comrades. The fact that they nevertheless reached Guam and later the Philippines borders on a miracle. For Magellan himself, it was proof that his vision was correct. The world could be sailed around and the Moluccas were accessible. But it was precisely here, at the point of his greatest triumph, that the path to catastrophe began. Instead of heading directly for the Spice Islands, he got involved in the political and religious conflicts of the Philippines. He proselytized, he forged alliances, and he believed that he had to prove his authority through military intervention. His decision to fight Lapu-Lapu was probably marked by pride and conviction that he was invincible even in the countryside. But this overestimation of himself led to his death. At the Battle of Mactan, he was overwhelmed by local warriors, while many of his men retreated. Magellan died not as a triumphant, but as a victim of his own hubris. The expedition barely survived him. Under the leadership of Juan Sebastián Elcano, Victoria managed to return to Spain. Of almost 270 men, only 18 reached Seville. But they brought with them what Magellan had promised: proof that the earth could be sailed around and the valuable spices of the Moluccas. The financial, political, and symbolic success was so great that Magellan was celebrated as the real father of the enterprise despite his death. Posterity made Magellan a legend. In Spain, it became a symbol of national greatness. In Portugal, it remained controversial for a long time, and in the Philippines, it is still considered the beginning of colonial oppression. His image is thus as diverse as the world he connected. In Europe, he was revered as an explorer. In Asia, he is often remembered as a conqueror. But it is precisely in this ambivalence that his historical greatness becomes apparent. He was a person who shaped world history without his work clearly being seen as a blessing or curse. Magellan's place between myth and history is also determined by the fact that he was not able to experience the full success of his expedition himself. Had he lived to see Victoria's return home, his fame would have been immeasurable. As it was, however, he remained the unfinished hero whose vision was completed by others. His name became a symbol of daring and tragedy at the same time. In the larger context of world history, Magellan marks the beginning of a new epoch. With his journey, the Earth was recorded as a coherent whole for the first time. Globalization, which today shapes all areas of life, began in these years. Trade, mission, science, and politics combined to form a global network, the first threads of which Magellan and his men spun. But this globalization brought not only progress, but also oppression, exploitation, and violence. Magellan's expedition was a reflection of this ambivalence. So Ferdinand Magellan remains a man between myth and history. He was the visionary navigator who broke the boundaries of the known world, but also the unyielding commander who conjured up his own end through toughness and pride. He was the pioneer of a global epoch, but also the harbinger of a colonial era that brought suffering to millions of people. His posthumous fame fluctuates between veneration and criticism, between heroic figure and warning. And perhaps it is precisely this complexity that makes it so important. Magellan represents the greatness and dangers of human curiosity. He shows that the longing to cross the horizon, to fathom the unknown and to connect the world is deeply rooted in people, and that this longing always demands sacrifices. His life and death are a legacy that continues to have an impact today. In the end, Magellan remains a figure that does not fit into a rigid image. Neither the pure hero nor the mere tyrant, neither the flawless martyr nor the failed adventurer, he is all of these at the same time. He is a person who dared to do the impossible and paid for it with his life. Between myth and history, it is a symbol of humanity itself, full of contradictions, full of longing, full of tragedy, and yet capable of changing the world.